Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. So I speak in English. I don't speak Spanish, sadly. And I just want to say thank you to Veronique to have organized the seminar. It's very nice to be here. Let me just say a few words about the idea of this seminar. What is it I'm going to try to do? So the theme is to try to talk and to discuss about religious violence through some sort of theological angle, biblical, rabbinic in particular. It's sadly, of course, it's a topic that has imposed itself upon us. It has imposed itself upon us because it's a reality that is really present in all corners of the world. When we think about religious violence, of course, we think about what happened in the Middle East, but we can also think about political violence that are related in more Christian eras of the globe as well. It's also present in India. So wherever we look, the reality is that religious violence is something that sadly we have to face. The difficulty is that once we've said that, it already and immediately brings it to its political dimension. And one has to be very careful in the sense that we can talk about religious violence in a religious context through a theological angle, even though it has political implication, and we can try and do that without talking about politics as such. So the thread, if you want, of what I'm going to do is to evoke theological reflections, and I'd like you to be involved in what I'm going to say and to get your response about the text that we're going to look at and see what they mean for you. And we'll keep those texts as theological as they are. We keep them as theological texts, but there is always a political tangent. There's always a political side to it that can be perceived. So what I've prepared is really 3/4 section to this seminar. So 3 essentially because I was looking at 3 different themes that are related to the question of political violence, and I want to explain them. I just mentioned them first, and I'll come back and explain them after. The biblical and the religious violence, the responsibility of the reader. That's theme number 1. Theme number 2 is the question of religious freedom. You should have no other God but me is a very strong biblical command, if you want. At the same time, we kind of value the fact that people have religious freedom, but how the two works together is to be seen. And one last point, which we'll do on Wednesday, is the question of the holiness of the land. This is maybe more political in the sense that we talk here about the Middle East. We're in the middle of a terrible conflict. So, you know, it's a really hard question. But somehow, even when you call that land the Holy Land, there's already a difficulty in the terminology because the holy very often translate into violence. The more holy, the more violence. So we'll try to look at this particular theme. So those are the 3 themes. When I said 3/4 themes, it's because I had given at the beginning, when we prepared the seminar with Veronique, I gave some readings to do. I don't know if you had time to look at them, but I will want to start the seminar by somehow looking a little bit at those texts, just a few passages from some of those texts and some response to that before we move into the first topic. So let me first of all say a few words about each of those themes, those 3 themes that I've mentioned. So the first one is the violence of the Bible. We know of plenty of biblical texts that are incredibly violent, and we'll look at them in a little bit later today. And the question I'm asking myself is, this is a book that has an authority. Whether you're a Jew or you're a Christian, the Bible, for us, the Tanakh, or the Old Testament in a Christian context, even though the Old Testament to a certain degree is corrected by the New Testament or as an addition to it, the Old Testament has a strong authoritative values, and there are a lot of very violent texts. So, and when I say violent texts, I mean not just texts that describe a violence, I mean texts that mandate a violent text that said this is what you should do. So my question here is, if we take those texts seriously, and if we feel that somehow we are commended by those texts as a rabbinic thinker, as a rabbinic figure myself, I take the biblical text seriously in terms of when the Bible says this is what you should do, I take that seriously. I don't just take it of saying, oh, it doesn't matter. So if we take those texts seriously, what strategy of reading do we have? How do we read those violent texts? So that's the question that I want to address. And it's absolutely essential, because if we don't do it, if we don't tackle that issue, there are some people who are going to take those texts in a literal sense and just going to apply them politically. Okay, so somehow that's this first step. The second topic is, you have no other God but me. And this is something that Jan Assmann is talking about in the preparatory reading I gave you. It's what he called the Mosaic exception, the monotheistic exception. There's no other choice. It's only this God, nothing else. Everything else has to be put to death. But at the same time, we pride ourselves of living in societies where somehow there is that element of religious freedom, which also includes the freedom of unbelief. So how do we reconcile those two? Is there a way to reconcile those two, both in a Jewish perspective and maybe in a Christian perspective as well? This is something that I want to look at, and I think it's important, because religious freedom and you should have no other God but me clash in a very obvious way. And even though we like to pretend or say, of course we respect religious freedom, the reality of the biblical text is a bit more complicated. Okay, so we look at that. And the last one is, of course, the holiness of the land as political violence. And here the point I'm trying to make is, it's very often a taboo subject. We don't want to talk about it too much because it has such a political tangent, and we have to be a little bit careful with that. But if the Bible talks about a holy land, and if the notion of holiness is understood in this way or another, it has implication as to how we behave on the ground. And again, here the conflict in the Middle East is not very far from those images that we can have. And what I will try to do is to show that even though there is the notion of the holiness of the land, and that the terminology that we're using might not be inductive to a peaceful understanding, there are maybe other strategies of reading the holiness, and to find in the Bible a language that relates to the question of the land, but that is indicative or indicative of a more peaceful relationship to the land. So we'll look at that as the third topic. Ideally, I thought we can separate every day into one different topic. It might not be so practical because we might not just finish one topic in 2 hours each time. So I think somehow we'll move on as we go along, and we'll stop whenever we have to stop when we get to the end of Wednesday. And what I would like to say, just before going back to the preparatory document, is just to say we're a small group, okay? Feel free to interrupt me, and feel free to tell me what you think, how you read the text. Because I think part of the interest is that we talk among each other about those passages. I will use a kind of a mix of classical rabbinic text, so from the period of the Antiquity, to modern philosophical Jewish texts. Those are texts you might not be familiar with, certainly probably the classical rabbinic text. And it requires a little bit of agility of the mind, not so much in understanding the text as we'll read them, but in order to extrapolate the text from its setting and to try to apply it to a more contemporary concern. So there is a need sometimes with those texts to decontextualize the text and to extrapolate from the text the kernel of what we think is in the text. And this is something that we'll try to do. So back to the, is that okay for everyone? Yeah? Okay. So back to the preparatory document. I gave you 4, and we're not going to look at the 4 document. I just want to look quickly at 3, just because I think it puts us in the mood of what we're supposed to do. And I want to point out to really what is really the essential. So I'll just say a few words about 3 of those texts. We'll read some of the key passages, and then I'll maybe try to add 1 correction to the text with text you haven't seen yet. So the first text is from Jan Assmann. He's a very well-known author, of course, and the book is a very well-known book, The Price of Monotheism. So I assume you might be familiar with this book. And if you remember, if you had time to do the reading, I had given quite a lot of pages. But the book is really making the claim that before the emergence of the biblical narrative, there were, of course, kind of religious tensions, wars, difficulty, but there was something that was called the primary religion and the secondary religion. The primary religion being the religion of the land here, and then suddenly there is a sort of a conflict, and B wins over A, but somehow takes the religion of A and translates the religion of A into a kind of a B plus sort of religion. So it's what is called here the translatability of that religious experience. And what Jan Assmann argues is that this is something that used to be in ancient times. That was always the case. That wasn't so much a problem. Religion was very fluid from that point of view. You just take the gods of those you have conquered and somehow you adapt them to your gods, and it works in a sort of a polytheist kind of setting. And he's pitching that, again, what he calls the monotheistic exception, the Mosaic exception, which is suddenly, instead of being translatable, here comes a religion that has a truth, that has an absolute truth, and that has a book where it's written. And he said from that point of view, of course, it creates a violence against the unacceptable truth of those you have just conquered. Instead of translating the religion of those you have conquered into your own religion and you kind of mix it, in a way, somehow there is this exception with the Mosaic faith. Okay, so that's kind of the point that he's making. And just to kind of understand what he has, I just want to read 1 or 2 of the passage here. I don't know if you have, I'll put the documents here on the page. It's page 19. And I just selected just a few passages so we have them in mind. 17, 18, and 19. Yeah, it's a little bit small, but it's probably, I can, yeah, maybe just with the finger I can make it bigger.
Like this?
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Okay, excellent. Yeah, that's okay. No, it's okay. It's okay like this. Yeah, we can leave it like this. Leave it like this, I think, because it'd be easier.
It seems that it doesn't have like the
Yeah. No, I think that's something we tried to do which didn't work earlier.
Okay.
So I think we can leave it like this. I'll just move the yeah. Oh. Yeah, okay. Let's leave it like this, yeah. Right. So I'm just going to move that here. It is important to note here. So I just want to read this, just a few lines here. It is important to note that the Mosaic distinction, so this is what I was trying to summarize, blocked such translatability. You know, the idea that you can kind of translate one religion into another just becomes impossible. Under monotheism, the peoples are still free to profess their faith in the one true God at the end of time, but the present form in which they worship the supreme being, are not recognized as being equally true. So you have an absolute truth that comes, that is written, okay, and everything that is measured against that truth is kind of put to the side. Jupiter, therefore, cannot be translated into Adonai, Yahweh, okay? On the basis of this distinction, and this is what somehow the religious tradition becomes a political tradition, on the basis of that distinction, the Jews would have found it impossible to forge a pact with the Assyrians, since the conclusion of the pact under oath would have implied the equivalence and mutual translatability of Ashur and Yahweh. Once you have this exclusive principle in the Mosaic tradition, it translates immediately into something political. You can't get an agreement. So it's not just that you have one God against the other, so the God of the Mosaic rule that somehow doesn't leave any space to the others, okay? But it's also that politically it becomes something that is impossible. So that was, to me, an important passage of this text. I'm just reading just a few more of the passage that I've highlighted, just so that we kind of remember the text. He has a passage that is actually really, really interesting and difficult. In particular, in Hebrew, it's here. In the Babylonian Talmud, you see in the middle. Yeah. How does that translate? This Mosaic exception and its violence. He's picked up something in the Babylonian Talmud, which is a text that was compiled from the 2nd to the 7th century. Okay? So in the Babylonian Talmudic treatise, and that's the reference Shabbat 89a, the question of the meaning of the word Sinai. The word of God came down from Mount Sinai. What is the meaning of Sinai? And here it's a play on word that the Talmud does, okay? It is called Sinai, the answer goes, because it is the mountain on which Sinah, okay? Sinai becomes Sinah, hatred descended to the peoples of the world, which really, in a way, is a Talmudic translation of what Jan Assmann is saying. There is something in that Mosaic law that has a potential of violence and hatred, which, to a certain degree, the Talmud recognizes. Now, of course, in Hebrew, it really is a play on word. It doesn't completely work, because it's not written Sinah, hatred, and Sinai is not the same letter. The sound is an S. Okay, you can hear it, Sinai, Sinah, but there are two S letters in Hebrew, and because Hebrew works with trilateral roots of 3 consonants, every letter has its importance. So the fact that it's an S, it's kind of a different S. Okay, so it doesn't completely work. But the Talmud is not bothered by the fact it doesn't work. The Talmud wants to make the point of saying, look at ourselves. Who are we? We are the one who've accepted Sinai. We have to recognize there is a certain violence in Sinai because it's an allusion to hatred. And somehow there is that element. Is that okay for everyone? And again, if you have any question about some of the terms I'm using, rabbinic references, please don't hesitate to ask. And the last passage I want to read is 2 pages later. It's on page 23. Page 23, where is it? Here, just at the beginning. I hope you can read here. The Mosaic distinction. So just read that. The Mosaic distinction refer, as I have already mentioned, to the distinction between true and false. It becomes binary. And of course, binary thinking is very often, though it's necessary on many grounds, in logical grounds and so on, but binary thinking in theological terms can also have its own grains of violence in it. My thesis is that this distinction represents a revolutionary innovation in the history of religion. It was unknown to traditional, historically evolved religions and culture. Here, the key difference were those between the sacred and the profane, or the pure and the impure. Neglecting an important deity amounted to a far more serious offense than worshipping a false god, which of course in the Mosaic distinction is the other way around. the chief concern of secondary, which was the chief concern of secondary religion. In principle, all religion had the same truth value, and it was generally acknowledged that relation of translatability pertained between foreign gods and one's own. The transition from primary to secondary religion experience therefore goes hand in hand with a new construction of identity, an alterity that blocks the translatability, which is what he started with, if you remember. And he adds to that something which I think is quite very nicely phrased. In place of what would call the hermeneutics of translation from one God to another, it becomes here the hermeneutics of difference. And of course, this is something that you find in the Jewish tradition very clearly. Judaism is about being different. You know, it's about being, Abraham moves from one side of the Jordan to the other side. The Hebrews are the ones who are me'ever, Ivrim are the ones who are me'ever la Yarden. The whole world is on this side, we are on the other side. So this notion of tension and this, what he calls this hermeneutic of difference is actually something that is very strong. So that's the point about the first text that I wanted to read together, so we have that in mind. Is that okay? This text? Yeah. Okay. So the second text I want to look at is from Richard Rubinstein. This is one of the texts that I had given you, and again, it sets the scene really for what we're dealing with. Richard Rubinstein, he died in not so long ago. He was a rabbi in the United States, and he wrote essentially in the late 60s, he wrote a book which is called After Auschwitz, which was kind of the major book of post-Shoah, post-Holocaust Jewish theology. But he also wrote a book, which is this one, The Cunning of History, which is usually about a book about slavery in a North American context, but he brings a kind of a theological Jewish slant to it. And here, while Rubinstein doesn't talk about secondary religion, like Jan Assmann did, it's something that is not very far from his thought, but he's going to take it in a very, very different way. He's going to see as the emergence of political and administrative violence, he's going to link that emergence to the creation of the Judeo-Christian narrative. Okay, so he's going to look at the emergence of monotheism as something that also generates violence, but in a slightly different way, and that's why I thought that text was interesting. And I'm going to turn to page 28, and I just want to read one passage here. Right. So here is what he says. It's a little bit of a longer passage, but he says, the earliest culture in which the world was disenchanted was the biblical world of the Israelites. So he said, this, now what happened is, the world of the Israelites, so let's say the Mosaic exception, if you want, is not just about, it's not about for him, about the translation and the blocking of the translatability. It's about a world that is disenchanted. What do you think that means? The disenchantment of the world.
The gods are not anymore in nature.
Yeah, there is something of the magic that is carried by the divine that is suddenly absent from the reality in which we live. It's not that God is not present in that reality, but he's present in a way that doesn't have this kind of enchantment magicality about it. And the argument that he's making is, once you have a world that is disenchanted, meaning it is not organized, it is not taken over, or there is no control of a magical divine, then what happened to the world? It's left to you entirely. It's disenchanted in that sense. It's left to you entirely. And for him, this is what permits the possibility of administrative superiority, and from there onwards of administrative violence, because the world doesn't have this kind of magical power, which to a certain degree was setting a limit of saying up to there, but no more. Once it's disenchanted, it's only to you, and if it's only to you and you don't have magical powers to appease, then you do whatever you want. And when you do whatever you want, this is where it can lead. So it's a kind of a strange analysis, but it's really not uninteresting. And listen how he puts it. He said, when the author of Genesis, yes, please, sorry. I come closer because I have a hearing problem. So.
I'm sorry. When he speaks of world as the human world, in a sense, it's not all of creation.
It's the human world. It's
the human world.
Yeah, it's the human world. So yes, it's not creation as such. It's the way we human understand our place and what is our function here. Okay. So when the author of Genesis wrote, and he goes right to Genesis 1:1, it's not that he said this is not something that's coming later. This is really from the start. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. He was expressing that disenchantment. Creation was seen as devoid of independent divine or magical forces which man had to appease. The world was seen as created by a supra-mundane creator. The Eternal created the heaven and earth. So you have this supra-mundane creator, and he creates heaven and earth, but essentially he's different. And if he's different, it's not magical. He's not there from that point of view. Okay, so there's nothing, and there's nothing to appease. I very much like the example that he gives a little bit later. So as long as man came to terms with the Creator, the world was theirs to do with as they pleased. No interference need be feared from powers immanent to the natural order. On the contrary, Adam is enjoined to subdue the earth and to have dominion over it. So there is a kind of an administrative power that is mandated by the biblical narrative. Thus, sorry, I missed a line. Now, he quotes Peter Berger, okay, the Austrian-American sociologist, theologian as well, has pointed out the biblical attitude that nature is devoid of magic or mysterious forces were extended to the political order. The fact that you said to Adam, have mastery and control over nature has also an implication on the political sphere. And he gives this fascinating example of a narrative story that we know in the Bible, which is the sin of King David with Bathsheba. Okay? And he makes the following point. I just move it so you can read the whole text. So thus, here, when David the king takes Bathsheba in adultery and arranges to have a husband, Uriah the Hittite, slain in battle, he is denounced by Nathan the prophet. Okay, that's the story. Nathan comes and says, what on earth have you done? And we would think, this is great. This is great. But why is it not so great? Because that proves that the king is only a human being. Disenchantment. There's no magical power in the king. There's no divinity in the king. Otherwise, Nathan the prophet would have never come to the king. Okay? So he said, that is the proof of this kind of disenchanted world. So yes, of course, the prophet can come to the king and tell him, what on earth have you done? But at the end of the day, the king doesn't have to care about what Nathan has said. There's nothing to appease. There's no divinity to appease as such. So he says, in the ancient Near East, the king was thought to be either a deity in his own right, or to incarnate divinity by virtue of his office. There was a magical something in the king, because there was this link between the divine and the political order. Okay? But what Nathan comes and do, which for us is ethical, he comes as a prophet and he says to the king, you're only a human being. But if the king is only a human being, where is the enchantment of the world? Okay? By denouncing David, Nathan was insisting that the king was only a man although one of preeminent importance, and that he was as subject to God's law as any other man. In ancient Israel, both the natural and the political orders were therefore disenchanted. The domain of divinity was relegated to the heavenly sphere. A beginning was made toward the secularization of the human order. You can trace secularism from the story of David and Bathsheba and the interference of the prophet Nathan. And if there is nobody to appease, how far can it go? Now, he makes a really interesting point, which is in, it comes just a little bit later. I think it's on page 31. I'll move it here. Let me just see exactly one mistake that we make. Yeah, here. Actually, hold on page 29, first of all. I wanted to go one step back. He makes the point that the Christian tradition, the Christian doctrine of incarnation, that Christ is simultaneously perfectly human and perfectly divine, okay? I think it's the Chalcedonian principle, is an attempt to re-enchant the world. There is something of this magical, and maybe magical is not the proper term, and I apologize for not having a better term, but it's a really, so here's a Jewish theologian, a rabbinic writer who talks about Christianity, who talks about incarnation, which is usually pretty rare, but the point is an interesting one. Incarnation is a way to reintroduce the divine into the real world. And it comes with all sorts of problems and difficulties and so on and so forth, but it's there. So it was an attempt to find, once again, an intrinsic link between the supermundane realm of divinity and the desacralized human order, which has become devoid of magic, mysterious forces. Okay? And of course, he makes the point that Protestantism has fought very hardly against this. It has chosen a disenchanted world rather than a world in which the possibility of re-enchantment was present. And the last passage I want to read about this is on page 31, which is where I was earlier, here, and it's one mistake here. One mistake often made by those who appeal to the humanistic ideal of the Judeo-Christian tradition is the failure to distinguish between the manifest value a tradition asserts to be binding and the ethos generated by the same tradition. Now here, he makes a very painful argument. You have to distinguish the manifest values. What are those? What are those manifest values that we have mostly in our Jewish Christian tradition? Yeah?
The value is there is only one God, and one must follow, in a sense, the commandments.
Yeah.
Essential, like God is like all.
Yes, exactly. So he says you have manifest values, which are things that you read. Okay, it's what's manifest. So love your neighbor, and you can decline that. I'm putting here to the side the problematic commandments, which we're going to look in a minute about when we go into the first topic of the violent passage in the text. But if you put to the side the violent passage in the text, the manifest of what you find are really what you read, love the eternal your God, love your neighbor, don't put a stumbling block before the blind, you name it, all those commandments. You say you have to distinguish between that and the ethos generated by the same tradition, which is, despite the fact that these are the values, what did it create? What kind of world did it create? Well, it created a world of extreme violence. Okay, so there is a kind of a disconnect. That's what he's pointing. He said there's this disconnect between what is written and actually what is done. And he said that you have to be aware of that. The Judeo-Christian tradition is said to proclaim on ethics in which every man is possessed of an irreducible element of human dignity. And Pope Francis wrote not so long ago about the dignitas of the fundamental dignity of the human being, and he hammered the point. Yes, all that we have, nevertheless, beyond all conscious intent, it has produced a secularization of consciousness involving an abstract, dehumanized, calculating rationality that can eradicate every vestige of the same human dignity. He said, therefore, the disconnect is enormous, and he's trying, through his analysis of the disenchantment of the world, of saying it's because of that that you can have this kind of total dichotomy of beautiful values and an ethos that is, in fact, much more complicated. Yes?
I was two questions.
Yes.
I was thinking of ecological problems, yes, because it's underneath. No?
It is, yeah.
Yes, I think it's, maybe you use this text to speak about
Yeah.
ecological topics. And also when you say you don't have to appease a God, but in the Bible, God is often very angry and asking for, in Jericho, because somebody has taken something, so it's not so simple.
So you have, so you're right. You have, in the Bible, of course, you have a God who is watchful of what we do. But it's not God who needs to be appeased. We have to correct our ways, certainly, but it's not a God in a kind of a magical way that needs to be appeased and therefore sets an absolute limit. And the point, of course, I think the point you're making is exactly the argument that Levinas is going to have, of saying, when we have a religious tradition in which, yes, there are demands of God upon us in terms of how we behave, and there is accountability, but if at the end there is forgiveness, and there is forever and infinite forgiveness, is the infinite forgiveness doesn't play a part in the extension of violence in a way in which an enchanted world in which the absolute was there, the God needed to be appeased. Here, it's not God that needs to be appeased. We need to be appeased, but at the end of the day, we can be forgiven. And the more you put the emphasis on the forgiveness, the more, to a certain extent, you permit the development of a certain form of violence.
Wouldn't it be the difference between a God who needs us? I mean, I'm thinking of Mesopotamia, but also in Mexico, you have to do things for God. So the gods are not happy, but you have to do something for God. Whereas in the Bible, God doesn't need that we do something.
That's right.
It's for us.
It's what he calls the extra-mundane creation. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. So God is not in heaven and earth. He created heaven and earth, and somehow it's left to you. Hashamayim shamayim lada. The heavens are for God, the earth is for us. We do what we want to do in this world. We might be accountable for what we've done, but fundamentally, what you do is for yourself. You are accountable for what you do, but there is no absolute limit. And I think that's kind of the point that he's making, trying to see in that structure of the biblical narrative, to try to see here one of the root of this abuse of administrative power. And the point he's making in the text is that, of course, slavery, okay, and he's not talking in a South American context, but he's talking in a North American context and in a European context, he said happens not in Catholic countries. So he's talking about Germany, okay? He's talking about slavery in America. He said there is something about that disenchantment that permits an overwhelming administrative power. That's kind of the argument that he makes. So it's very related to, surely debatable, of course, but it's kind of an interesting take about this idea, how far is the idea of disenchantment of the world can be taken in political terms.
Because there was slavery
Yes, that's why I say he doesn't talk. He's not talking here. He doesn't take that into account. There was slavery in South America for sure. I agree, and that is surely a counter argument to the thesis that he has. But you know, no. But those are kind of ideas in a way that he wants to put forward, which do not have a full-fledged validity.
Yes, but it's a matter of degree.
It's a matter of degree as well.
You would have disenchantment among the Catholic, and even more so
In the Protestant world, yeah. Okay, so this is the second text, and I'm just going to turn quickly into the third text, which was the reading of Levinas. So let me, Richard Rubinstein I can get rid of. Hold on, Levinas, it must be this one. No, it's not this one. It must be... oh, I don't know if we have it. I don't know if we have it here. Okay, no, I don't think I have it here. Okay, I'll just. It's okay. I'll just tell you in a way. It's. I'll just read to you one or two of the passage of Levinas, but I'll just summarize. Yeah. You have it in the document that I sent. It's the text by Ruud Velten. No, that's another one. That's another one from Levinas. I think we just forgot to upload it, but it's okay. I'll just tell you what it is. So here is a secondary reading on Levinas, but essentially, Levinas here takes a sort of a philosophical take, and what he tries to present is ethics as violence, which is a kind of a really interesting take. And what he tries to do is to say that there is in what permits ethics, which is the encounter with the other, so the face of the other, the presence, the eruption of the other in our lives, he sees the eruption of the other as a fundamental violence to who I am to start with. In the sense that I didn't ask the other to be here. I didn't want the other to be here. And of course, if you take that in a political sense, okay, it's true with the individual, but it's also true in a very political sense. The emergence of the other in what is otherwise your own narrative. Whether you're talking about for the Israelis, if you're talking about the emergence of the Palestinians. Here's the other who suddenly have to do something. The emergence of the Israelis for the Palestinian is a kind of a reverse question, but it's still the emergence. So there's a violence here. It's a violence that doesn't do anything, but it's a violence because I would be better off if they were not here. Okay? And it's not fitting my narrative. It's not fitting who I thought I was. So Levinas is just taking this notion, and he said that this is a violence that is a necessary violence in order to be able to overcome that violence. So he said the ethics that is generated by the face of the other that emerged to me as a primary violence has the capacity to be overturned into a non-violence. But it is a violence to start with. So even in very philosophical terms, it's that. So I just read to you. You don't have it here, but he says this scholar from the Netherlands, this professor from the Netherlands, said to Levinas, the face is not the bringer of peace, but of anarchy. You know, the others emerge to me like this. It commands in a disturbing way. The face disturbs the other of the ego in a violent way. Okay? Isn't it counterintuitive to understand the face as violence, since according to its original ethical claim, it exactly overcomes violence? Is violence indeed conquered by the face of the other? And if so, isn't this conquest only possible because of this violence? In other words, I need a violence done to me so that I can overcome the violence that the others generate in me. I need at some stage to be in front of such a violence in order to have a chance to overcome the violence. It's a kind of a very subtle take. Is the face, unbearable as it seems to be, the necessary evil which makes me ethical? In other words, I can't be ethical alone. The Palestinians can't be ethical without Israel. The Israelis can't be ethical without the Palestinians. It's only because the other emerged in front of me in a way that I didn't want to, that somehow it puts me in front of this choice. Either I find the ethical solution or I don't find the ethical solution. But there is this violence here that starts with. In other words, is ethics the first discipline? Is ethics as first discipline the solution to violence, or is it rather its cause? So regarding Levinas, it seems that we have to deal with at least two notions of violence. One, the violence of the face. The other, the violence that must be overcome by the face. So it's only when I actually overcome the first violence of the other who's here and say, I didn't want to see him, but now that I see him, is there something in that face that's going to touch me? And we know that sometimes people are not touched by the face. Okay? So it has the potential of falling into something horrible, but it has the potential of falling into something ethical. And there is no ethics unless there is this first violence that is done. So essentially, the other passages to read, but it's what I wanted to look at in order to kind of remember what we talked about. Now, I just want to bring here two small corrections to those introductory texts. Or not corrections, but two small comments. The first one is, let me see, 1, 2, 3, Shaul Magid. This is the one. So this is a text. This is an American scholar who wrote a book which is called American Post-Judaism. So it's a very contemporary writing. It's 2013 or something like this. What he's dealing with is we're living in a post-ethnic society, and what is Judaism, which is also a very ethnical religion? What is the place of Judaism in this modern world? Okay, and the point I want to make with this is only this one. It talks about the Mosaic distinction, and I just want to take one thing from this, because he talks about the Mosaic distinction, the monotheistic distinction of this monotheism that somehow is the root cause somehow of that violence, if you remember the thesis of Jan Assmann. So he only writes this. He said, when we speak of monotheism today, we really speak about biblical monotheism, and he's commenting here on Jan Assmann, you can see in the title, okay? The title was the Mosaic distinction, okay? Or at least we think of what is biblical monotheism, what we think is biblical monotheism. In fact, most of us do not think that there is any other kind. The medieval Islamic and later Jewish and Christian project of mixing together Greek philosophical categories to the biblical tradition has made it difficult for us, as their spiritual progeny, to distinguish between Hellenistic monotheism and biblical mythical monotheism. Thus, when we speak of something like pantheism as a theism, and thus heresy, we are really speaking about the ostensible rejection of biblical monotheism, not necessarily the rejection of monotheism. So the only thing that I want to take from this, okay, is that what he's saying is just be careful with the terms. Just be careful with the term. He puts at the end a little bit further that remember that the terms monotheism and polytheism are 17th century construct. They're not something that were part of any sort of biblical imagery and so forth. But we have to be careful with the text of Jan Assmann, because when he says that monotheism has this kind of exception about one God and not of the other, what are we talking about? We are talking maybe of a biblical something. we are not talking about anything we recognize. So he says, we monotheists, Judaism is a monotheistic faith, okay? But it is not biblical faith. Judaism has almost nothing to do with the biblical religion. Judaism is a rabbinic religion. Okay, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but you are certainly familiar with the emergence of Christianity. Okay, Christianity emerged at the end of the Second Temple Judaism, okay, at the end of the Second Temple, and it comes out of there. Judaism emerges more or less at the same time. We pretend to have a link with the Bible, but the rabbis are not living in a biblical time. They are making their own religious tradition. So you can talk about the Mosaic exception, but the Mosaic exception in a biblical sense, not in a Jewish sense. So it's not because the Mosaic exception has this incredible violence that you can talk about that Jan Assmann has pointed out. It's not because you have that it actually reflects on anything that is Judaism or Christian from that point of view. Because in reality, we are not biblical. Christianity is probably a little bit more biblical than Judaism, in truth. A little bit, not on the violent question, but simply in terms of the ritual. You have a priest, there are rituals that are kind of sacred rituals. We don't have priests. We don't have sacred rituals. We are a little bit, we Jews are a little bit more detached maybe in terms of ritual practice from the biblical narrative than Christianity, I think. Yes?
So it is possible to say that rabbinic tradition, modern Judaism, and Christianity are religions inspired in the Bible, but not are related directly with the Bible.
Yeah. So not only you should say that, but in reality, the question is, this is the question of the ways that parted or the ways that never parted. Judaism and Christianity emerged of biblical Judaism, both. Which one emerged first? Usually, so I teach at the Gregoriana in Rome, and I always have the right of precedence of saying, if I'm on a panel, it's like, you start first, right? Because as if I was here first, right? Okay. The truth is that we are not. We are not. Rabbinic Judaism took longer to emerge than the early church. So in many ways, and many scholars have argued, that the canon of Rabbinic Judaism is a response to the canon of the early church. That it works the other way around. So, so not only are we emerging from biblical Judaism, but the order of emergence is very... Now, to put it in very bold terms, okay, you are not less Jewish than I am in a kind of historical kind of way. Of course, today when we say Jewish, we mean Rabbinic Judaism. So that, of course, I'm more Rabbinic Judaism than you are. But fundamentally, you have the same claim as Judaism has as to its relationship to the Bible or its disconnect with the Bible. There are lots of things which the church also had difficulty to connect with the Bible. The early councils had all sorts of difficulties with what became cardinal thinking of the Catholic Church. Okay, of early Christianity and then later on the Catholic Church. So here, this is an important text because while we take Jan Assmann seriously about the Mosaic exception, yes, but in a biblical sense, not in a rabbinic sense. Okay, and I want to show you an example of this. And this is going to be a little bit difficult, but I think you will... So hold on, let me just get rid of what I don't need. Yeah, that should be here. Okay, so this is reading here. Mishnah is a text from the 2nd century. It's the first code of Jewish law. And the reason I'm showing you this text is because it's a text that's dealing with a violence. the violent issue about the Mosaic exception, as it were. Okay? Now, this is a commentary of Levinas on the Mishnaic text. So let me read to you the passage that is here. It's an unpleasant text about violence. All those who are liable to excision, and he puts in bracket, excision means here the celestial intervention. This is the God who comes, punish directly. You've done so and so, boom, you're going to be punished directly by God. So this is really typically the God of Jan Assmann, of this God. We are not here at all in the Rubinstein question, okay, the disenchantment. This was Rubinstein. This is, okay. So this is the God who is so unhappy about your behavior that he comes, and it's called karet. He comes and he cuts off your life. Okay? If they have submitted to whipping, okay, you take lashes. If they have been submitted to whipping, they are exempt from excision. What does that mean? So God says, if you have done so and so, I will kill you. The rabbi said, if the rabbinical court has decided that I'm going to give you a few lashes, God cannot intervene anymore. Okay? You have a very interesting take here. Violence against violence. There is the violence of this God of the Bible who comes and is going to kill you for whatever transgression, horrendous thing you've done. Okay? And there is a rabbinic court who says, I don't like that God. That I don't like. I can't do nothing. So I'm going to take my baton, my whip, okay? And I'm going to give you a few lashes. And once I've given you a few lashes, you're punished already. And God has to obey by the fact that we have punished you. He can't punish you again. Okay? So you're trading one violence for another. Because it is written, he shall have inflicted upon him 40 lashes, not more. Otherwise, in surpassing this number, one would inflict too many on him, and your brother would be degraded in your eyes. So the rabbi said there is a verse in Deuteronomy that says, how many lashes can I give? 40. In fact, it's 39, but okay. Let's say 40. 40, not more, because if more, your brother would be degraded. Two things that are interesting here. One, the one that you're punishing is your brother. Can he be your brother if you don't punish him? Can someone be your brother if you don't intervene? Including against God, who is supposed to kill this man. You say, okay, you know, I can say, I said, this is not my problem. You know, if God wants to punish him, let him punish him. If I have to intervene, I have to intervene because he's my brother. There is a level of intervention. Here it's written 40, but let's now extrapolate because, okay, there's a level of intervention in which my brother remains my brother. If I overstep the mark, even by one, he's degraded. Okay? Now, it's a very difficult text because this is violence for violence. Okay? This is really not easy. But he said, one sanction, he's as your brother, such is the opinion of Rabbi Hanina ben Gamliel. And I want to read to you what comes after. Human courts, at the end. Human courts thus would deal with the faults which cast us out of the human and would repair the unrepairable. This is what God would do. This vengeful God who would come and cut you off of life by killing you is because you've done something that is irreparable. And suddenly you learn that the human court can intervene against God in order to repair something that God says is not repairable. Now, what's interesting in this is that if you remember the point of Jan Assmann, the point was that, okay, this is the Mosaic exception and this is the God of violence. Okay? the reality is Judaism is not about the God of violence. Here, you have a very clear intervention of Judaism against the God of violence. It's generated its own violence. Okay. But this is not a violence that's going to cast you out of the human fold. Okay? Can a court do as much as mercy or grace can do? Is great manifest at court? Forget for an instant the disgraceful image of whipping. Forget the violence of the excision and the formalism of the judicial procedure. The notion of lashes indicate a human sanction whose essence would consist precisely in touching the intangible personal dignity of the neighbor. Okay? This is what the lashes do. It, to a certain degree, it touches the dignity of the person. Where does grace fit into this? But the reference to Deuteronomy 25:3 is explicit. It is here that the love of the neighbor must give all it can. All it can give, sanction without degrading, interference in the affairs of the other without touching his freedom, and not the court and justice this extreme measure of a difference, which is a differential. I'm not 100% sure about the last phrase, it's a bit obscure to me, but you understand what the passage is about. It's this rabbinic correction to the biblical violence. Okay? And it's saying there is no love of the neighbor if you do not accept that you have to interfere in the life of the neighbor. And interference in the life of the neighbor here takes the form of a certain violence, the violence of the whipping, but the suggestion of Levinas, this is the Talmudic commentary of Levinas, okay? The suggestion of Levinas is that what is at stake here is not the whipping as such, is that my intervention towards the other creates always a certain form of violence. Otherwise, it's just like, I don't care. Do whatever you want. I don't want to interfere. I don't want to tell you what I think. You know, I'm not going to prevent you. You want to do something stupid. I respect, it's your freedom. Do something stupid. If you don't want that because you care for the neighbor, then at some stage there is a level of violence that you impose on the other, which is very similar to what Levinas was saying at the beginning. The eruption of the other into my life creates some sort of violence at some stage, which needs to be. So those were kind of texts to bring us back to the readings. Now, what I'm going to do now is we're going to turn to the first topic as such, and I took a little bit of time to go through the introductory reading, but they're part of the topic, so I don't think it matters that much. And the passage I want to deal with now is the question of the violent passages of the biblical text. Now, how do we deal with such violence, and what kind of methodology of reading we can have? Okay. Now, if you think of a text of biblical violence, which one eventually would you have in mind? You know, we know there are biblical texts which mandate violence, but which one would you have in mind as such? Yeah.
Jeremiah and the verse.
Jeremiah and?
No, it's not Jeremiah. Sorry, it's the verse. When some young people said to the prophet, you have no hair in your head, and immediately some bears appears and kill the young.
Okay. Any other one that's kind of almost more obvious in political sense, maybe? The book of Joshua. Okay, the book of Joshua is a perfect example of things which are really I mean, the violence is just so obvious that it's unavoidable. And the question, of course, is, well, how do we read such texts? What do we do? So what I want to do is I'm going to get rid of what we don't need anymore. So this we've read, and we back to Joshua 8, section 8. And I've put you here the Hebrew-English version of the book of Joshua. I took chapter 8. I could have taken any other chapter in the book of Joshua because pretty much every chapter you read is about political violence. But just to have just a few lines here. And the Lord said unto Joshua, fear not, neither be you dismayed. Take all the people of war with you and raise and go up to the city of Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai and his people and the city and his land. So it's the conquest of the land, okay? Which I'll explain why I've chosen that chapter later. If you go to the next passage here, just a little text at the top. You see it's starting on verse 7. And you shall rise up from the ambush and take possession of the city. So the order is to make a kind of a trick, to make a plot so that part of the people would go here. And when they go here, you can invade the city. The people with arms are outside. They're going to be slaughtered outside. And you can go back into the city and slaughter everybody. And you shall rise up from the ambush and take possession of the city. For the Lord your God will deliver it into your hand. And it shall be, when you have seized upon the city, that you shall set the city on fire according to the word of the Lord you shall do. And then again, if you go towards the end, I'm just taking a choice passage, verse 16, here in the middle. And all the people that were in the city of Ai were called together to pursue after them, and they pursued after Joshua, and they were drawn away from the city. And there was not a man left in Ai or in Bethel that went not out after Israel, and they left the city open and pursued after Israel. So that's the trick. They left the city open. They're pursuing part of Israel, and of course the other part of Israel is going to go back into the city. And the Lord said unto Joshua at the end here, stretch out your javelin that is in your hand towards Ai, for I will give it into your hand. And Joshua, we can go on forever. I mean, it's... God has stretched out his javelin and so on and so forth, and, it continues maybe on verse 24, just so we, get a grip with it. And it came to pass when Israel had made end of slaying all the inhabitants of the city of Ai in the field, even in the wilderness wherein they pursued them, and they were all fallen by the edge of the sword until they were consumed, that all Israel returned unto Ai, and smote it with the edge of the sword. And all that fell on that day, both men and women, were 12,000, even all the men of Ai, for Joshua drew not back his hand, wherein he stretched out his javelin until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. Okay, so we have that level of indisputable violence, and I don't know how it is in a church context. I don't know of a synagogue context in which you read, for liturgical purposes, such a text. Now, in a church, I know you have readings, biblical readings, and New Testament reading, obviously. I would be surprised if such texts were read for liturgical purposes. They're probably not, okay? Jericho, maybe the fall of Jericho.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's different because you have all...
You have the encircling, and then the thing happens miraculously, the walls fall. It's kind of convenient. This is the enchanted world. It's when it's disenchanted that it's problematic, because you have to do it yourself. Okay? So somehow, I think what's interesting here is that it shows we have an intrinsic difficulty with such texts. Now, the way it gets more difficult, to me at least, is in a way what comes after. And I'll turn to the next page. It's still on chapter 8. I'm reading it from verse 31. As Moses, so they did all that, okay? They did all that. They slaughtered everybody, okay? As Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded the children of Israel, so they did as if everything was commanded. This is the mandated violence that I was talking about in the introduction. This is in the book of the law of Moses. And an altar of unhewed stones upon which no man has lifted up any iron, and they offered thereon burnt offering into the Lord and sacrificed peace offering. So they slaughtered the city, and what do they do after?
Peace offering.
Peace offering, but you see, peace offering of a very particular kind. First of all, because it's for God, let's ensure that the altar is of unhewed stones, meaning stones that haven't been cut by an iron tool, which is a tool of war. This is the summum of religious hypocrisy according to Isaiah. It's like, we've slaughtered everybody, but now that we've killed everybody, let's build a temple and let's ensure that the temple is built with stones that no tools of war would have ever touched. Okay, so, there's this kind of, suddenly it takes a turn of saying, you want to say, who are those idiots? I mean, what's that? What is this about? And again, a little bit later, verse 35, towards the end of the chapter, there was not a word of all that Moses commanded, which Joshua read not before all the assembly of Israel, and the woman, and the little one, and the stranger that walks among them. So you've just been told that you have slaughtered all the men, and all the women, and all the children, and everything. And then you said, I have been a temple that is a testimony to my non-violence. Okay? And on top of that, there is not one word of everything that Moses has commanded that Joshua has not read to the people. Well, I'm not sure what he read, because while you do have passages about violence in the text, that's one of them, okay? You also have passages in which you don't do that. We were talking about, love your neighbor as yourself. You don't, people are eventually, you're allowed to go in battle, but only in that condition. There's all sorts of words that Joshua could have read. So there is here this kind of build-up of a religious hypocrisy to a certain degree. And you wonder what kind of mix is suddenly created between the political text, which is the beginning of Joshua 8, of the conquest of the city of Ai, and then you can take it for every other city. The text is very repetitive, and we'll see what we make of that. So there's this political thing about the conquest of the land, and then suddenly there is this religious element that comes in, but in a way that is so out of sync with what we've read. So it really, I think, creates something that is really difficult for the reader.
Sorry,
Yes, please, Véronique.
What about the fact that archaeology is showing now that
Nothing happened.
nothing happened?
That's right. Yes. Okay, so I'll answer that in a way that is not maybe completely satisfactory, because we could say, well, look, this is just a narrative. Okay, this is just narrative. But from a rabbinic point of view, and I'm not sure here if in a Christian take it would be the same, but from a rabbinic point of view, the text is what is important, not the archaeology. What I'm dealing with is what the text tells me. That's what I have to deal with. The fact that archaeology proves the case or disproves the case is almost irrelevant. The same thing for the Exodus from Egypt. There's no archaeological evidence from the Exodus from Egypt, and yet the Exodus from Egypt is a fundamental narrative anchor of rabbinic thinking. So the reality of what really happened on the ground is kind of outside of the rabbinic mind. The rabbinic mind is not really concerned by what really happened on the ground. It's concerned with, this is what the text tells me, and I have to try to come to terms with it. Now, the difficulty when I'm saying this is at the same time, you see here, there's a kind of relationship between the religious element, which are the two last parts we've read, and the political side to it, which is the conquest of the city. So, to completely separate the two is not so obvious either.
You know this book, La Bible révélée,
Yeah. Yeah, by the Frankenstein. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
I think that was quite a shock for many Christians. So it was not a shock for.
No.
No.
No. The Jews are not shocked by those kinds of things because we don't believe in the text in that sense. We believe in the text in terms of this is what the text says, and this is what we deal with. Whether that's the reality is a completely different issue, which doesn't, that really doesn't shock.
But if it didn't happen in reality, then why would we use the text to do it in reality now?
Okay. So this is okay. I'm glad you're asking this question because this is what I wanted to go to. Is that say somehow why do I bring this? Okay, why do I bring this? Because there is now in Judaism, unlike what diaspora Judaism has known, there is now a return to biblical religion in the Jewish tradition. Okay, so there is now this return of people who actually say, and this is something that has been created since the creation of the State of Israel, for obvious reason, there was a return to the land. So somehow, the rabbinic imagination that was created outside of the land suddenly is confronted to a political reality in the land, and somehow there is now a tendency to say we live in a post-rabbinic world, that everything that the rabbis had done is not so relevant for the Jewishness of the Jewish people today as represented in the State of Israel. And it is important because it's 60% of the Jewish people. So, what happened in the State of Israel has an impact on what is Judaism. But there is, just exactly as you felt, there is a tendency to return. And what's at stake, and this is the point I wanted to make here, is what's at stake is you have now people who, rather than say, this is a religious text that is made to make you think, they now consider that the text is only here because it describes a reality as it is. Hence, the importance of archaeology in Israel, which has always been a really, really important thing, which never was in Rabbinic Judaism before. So there's a huge shift towards a more literal, historically based kind of Jewish thinking, contemporary Jewish thinking, okay? Which comes, of course, with a huge, huge set of problems. And I'm hesitating. I mean, I'm not hesitating because I'm going to do it, but I just want to give you a little bit of warning about the text that I'm going to do now, okay? And I do that because I feel comfortable being here, and I understand, and I hope you understand why I will show the text that I'm going to show, okay? But let me just explicit the warning. The text I'm going to show is not a text that I value in any sort of way. It doesn't represent me, none whatsoever, okay? But I want to show it to you because it indicates what is it that some Jews make of that text. And the reason I'm doing this is because it is only if you understand what they do with such a text that you need to find a strategy of reading that is different. In other words, there's a hermeneutical war going on. There's a war with those who are going to take those texts and say, this is what it is. This is what you do. Okay? And there are those who are going to say, listen, this is not the reading I want to have of that particular text. So the text that I'm going to put on the board is, okay, this is a text, it's called here the Jewish Canon. The only reason I took this text of 2020 is because the text he's quoting is a text which is called Torat HaMelech, which is what you'll have here. Okay, the Torat HaMelech. Torat HaMelech means the Torah of the king. Okay, Now, this is a text that is not, that I can't purchase. I've never seen that text. I've only seen the passage quoted. For a very simple reason. This is not a text that I would purchase, and I don't want to go into a kind of website where you would be able to buy that text. So this is a text by Jewish radicals, like really, really radicals who are, as you can imagine, going to use the text of Joshua and some passage in the book of Deuteronomy in order to say, here's the mandate to what we want to do in Israel with the Palestinians, and we can just do it. And that's the end of it. So the text is available. You can go into a particular website. The book is forbidden. You're not allowed to buy it in library. You never find it. You need an authorization to buy it. Or to yeah. The text is forbidden in Israel. But if you go online, you can find a way. Okay? But I didn't want to do that, so I'm only using a secondary source for that. Okay? And it is enough to give you an idea of what some people do with those kinds of text. Okay, and again, the interest for me is that this is sufficient to help us understand, what kind of alternative way we should look at those texts. So I'm starting the one in the middle here. So this is directly from the Torah Tameler. And I'm just going to read 3 short passages. There are situations, make it a bit bigger so you have it. There are situations in which we would want deliberately to harm specifically the innocent. Okay, starts well already. Their presence and their killing are actually beneficial and helpful for us. For example, harming young children of the evil king family, so the Jewish king against the evil king of the, back to Jan Assmann thing. Though they are now innocent, but it's still good, killing them help us to hurt him so that he will stop fighting against us. Okay? 2, the one at the bottom. If it is permissible for the king to kill his own citizen for the sake of war, by forcing them to risk their life by fighting on his behalf, the same reasoning applies as well to the citizens of the evil kingdom. So it's it's the kingdom fighting, you're back into a full biblical context. Now this is rabbinic writing, contemporary rabbinic writing, of a very, very marginal fringe of the Jewish people, but nevertheless, yeah.
It remembers me a little bit the position of Catholic and Lutheran Church according to the regulation of the war. Yes,
because you have people in all sorts of religious tradition who will take the text and make the same with it. So yes, I'm not surprised by what you're saying, yeah. So he says, this applies to the citizen of an evil kingdom in a war of righteousness against evil, so you have to have the humility to know what is righteousness and what is evil, Of course, there's no question. We all know that. We presume that eventually evil will harm us even if we let it rise its head, and the citizen of the evil kingdom will suffer from it as well. So you can presume that someone is going to turn evil, and you can kill him before he turns evil. Okay, so you're in a kind of total delirium of what you can do. And the last one is back at the... There was a logic as to why I didn't follow the order, but I can't remember why I did that. And although the civilians were tied or imprisoned, and they have no choice rather than to stay in place and be hostage, it is permitted to run over them and to kill them if this is the way to be saved from the evil. Okay? Young children are often in this situation. They block the rescue in their presence, and they do so unwillingly and unintentionally. Still, it is permitted to kill them as their presence assists the murdering. So what they do here is, those are the texts from Torah Tameler. And they're not exactly the text I would have liked to choose from Torah Tameler. I've read articles about Torah Tameler, but because I don't have the text, I took whatever was available. But essentially, this is a political agenda. It's what's called, it's halachic in the sense that it's a Jewish legal take on the story. It's going to take passages from Deuteronomy and passages from the book of Joshua, and it's going to use those texts to set up a legal rule saying this is what you're allowed to do. You're allowed to kill the innocents, you're allowed to kill the hostage, you're allowed, and here when they said the hostage, I mean the prisoners, okay, I'm not talking here about the Israeli hostage, this is a different situation. I'm talking about here about Jews under a Jewish king who would have taken evil soldiers of the evil king as prisoners, and you're still allowed to kill them. And it's this kind of crazy narrative, but you know you get the idea. If I turn, you'll see if I turn to page 100, there's a little commentary that's actually quite interesting because it really carries the essence of what we're looking at. In Baruch HaGever, which is another kind of book like this, Ginsburg, who's the name of the writer, offers 5 legal principles that either justify, I don't know if you remember Baruch Goldstein, the story of Baruch Goldstein, who massacred a dozen Muslim worshippers at the Cave of the Patriarchs in 1994. Okay? Way back already, like 30 years ago. And even deemed it to have been an obligation for him to do so. And these are, 1, the sanctification of the name of God, so you're talking about holiness, that justify that. 2, saving the life of Jews at the expense of spilling non-Jewish blood. 3, blood feuds. 4, extermination of Amalek and extermination of evil. There is twice in the Bible references to, or at least in the Torah, references to the war of extermination against Amalek, which is the archetype of absolute evil. Okay? And 4, taking the promised land by war. Okay, which is of course the political slant that we're talking about. Rabbi Yitzchak Shapira, one of the authors of the Torat HaMelech, is one of Ginsburg's senior students and heads of the yeshiva, the rabbinic school, in the settlement of Yitzchak, which is a little settlement in the territories. Okay? Together with Ginsburg, he's a founding member of a movement dedicated to replacing current Israeli law with Torah law. Torat HaMelech focuses on one particular issue, the killing of non-Jews, whether combatant or innocent, according to Jewish law. That's halacha. The author invoked here, as well as the notion of revenge as possible halachic value. Both of these texts challenge the basic hesitance of modern rulers, poskim rulers, legal ruler, to adjudicate in state matter. They provide a way in which halachic tools per excellence could be utilized to set the norms of Israeli society, and this way is expensive, creating and harshening values to override legal tradition, and most important, showing total disregard for state law. So you have here, I'm passing the kind of inner Jewish political question here, but he's pointing out that this Torat HaMelech is emerging from a group of people who want to replace the laws of the State of Israel, which is a secular country, with religious law according to their reading of the religious law, which in particular is based on this issue of the book of Joshua. Everything is permitted for the conquest of the land, for the possession of the land, and so on and so forth. So the reason I'm putting this is just to make you understand that you have people who are going to look at the mandate given by those texts in order to translate that mandate into religious contemporary doctrine and political activism. So if we don't want that to happen, then what is it that we do?
I'm sorry, what is the impact of those texts on ultra-Orthodox?
Ultra-Orthodox? None. The ultra-Orthodoxy is not interested by the political situation. The ultra-Orthodoxy in Israel, they just want to study. Okay? They have problems of their own because they have a different kind of violence, in particular violence against women. Okay? But they are usually not so involved with violence for territories as such. This is more what's called the national religious parties. Okay, so I'll take your question in a second. So if you hear of the name, one of the ministers was Ben Gvir. Okay, Ben Gvir is in that movement. Almost, I'm not sure he formally is, but he's in that kind of movement. The ultra-Orthodoxy is not so much. Yeah.
So is the use of these verses from political parties not for religious?
They do it in a religious way, because as you see, what they do is they say this becomes the legal religious norm. That's why this is a religious book. In theory, it's a religious book.
No. So I mean, is some religious branch of Judaism who assume these verses like something important, something relevant in his theology?
Yeah, exactly. So it's those groups, and basically what they do is they bypass the whole of the rabbinic tradition, 20 centuries. They bypass the 20 centuries of religious tradition, and they stick to the text. It's a literalist reading of the text, as we know in other religious. It's not just, Islam has the same problem. Islam has the same problem. Some Christians have the same problem with a very literal reading of the text. But in an explosive and complicated political situation, the risk of refusing the distance that was created by 20 centuries of rabbinic thinking becomes horrendous. Okay? So what I want to look at now is, so that's enough for Torah Tamelech, I'm going to get rid of it, and I'm going to turn to, what I want to do is I want to look at three kind of strategies of reading. Yes, please.
Yeah, hi. To be honest, my mind or my head is a little like a complete mess at the moment.
Okay, sorry.
Trying to grasp all the information that you're saying, but earlier you mentioned that there was kind of a detachment, right, from, for example, the rabbi tradition or the rabbinic tradition from the biblical text, right? And they are trying now to return to it. But so where does the connection lie then between the rabbinic religion, let's say, and
yeah, okay, that's a good point. No, it's I confirm that your question makes a lot of sense. Okay, so the connection normally is when the rabbis have made the rabbinic rules, which is in the Mishnah that we looked at earlier, in the Talmudic text, in the codes of Jewish laws that have been produced over centuries that kind of define Jewish practice. The connection they have with the text is a linguistic connection. It's a hermeneutical connection. So they try to twist the text so that there is a connection with the text, but it's a connection that is not about the literal meaning. It's about they read words in a different way than the traditional reading of the text permits. Now, if I had no, that's a way.
Not yet.
Yeah, I need 2 minutes to answer you because I thought I came prepared, but nothing compared to you. Right? So Hebrew is based on 3 consonant words, okay, which I symbolize with an X. Okay, and you read Hebrew this way. Okay, there's no vowels in Hebrew. Okay, so you just have to try to imagine if you're writing in Spanish and you get rid of the vowels. Okay, so when there are no vowels, what it means is that words can be vocalized differently. So I can read a word in different way if I change the vowels that obviously when I speak I need vowels, but when I write I don't write with vowels. And the biblical text in its original form has no separation between words. So you have to think about it as a matrix, okay, that goes with no separation from the beginning. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. To the end of the Torah, there's no separation. So the question is, how do you separate to give meaning? So when we read the text, in the beginning God created, I have separated words in the beginning. Okay, imagine the same in Hebrew. So I separate the words like this, okay. But I don't have to do that. I can say, I don't need to put a split here, I just put a split here, then I put a split here, or I don't put a split here, I put a split here, you know, and I change the vowel. So the text becomes an opening for an infinity of readings. Okay? So the text is kind of open as to what it could mean if I were to read it in a way that is different from the narrative that I know if I take a Bible and open the Bible today. So from that point of view, the relationship of the rabbinic tradition to the text is hermeneutical. It's based on how do I read those consonants. And from there, I can depart greatly from what I think the text tells me, what we assume the text tells me. Okay? So this is why the rabbi would very often says, reading a verse, they say, don't read that, but read that. And it's the same word, but vocalized differently. Or instead of having put the separation after the second consonant, they put 4 consonants together and say, look, it's a different word now, it means something else. So that's the relationship to the text. What makes it rabbinic is that hermeneutic. In other words, a rabbi who comes and who says, I think this is what the text should say, but doesn't work the hermeneutics of the details of the Hebrew, is not in the rabbinic tradition. This is just someone who has an idea. And it could be a great idea, but it's not rabbinic. So the rabbinic link between the idea that they express and the text is in their ability to find in the text whatever they need as long as they can find it in the text. So they do that in 2 different ways. 1, because of that. 2, because they relate different parts of the text. So they say, in Genesis it says that, but the same word is used in the book of Judges, and I'm going to use the context of the book of Judges to bring it back into the book of Genesis, so therefore it changed the meaning, and so on and so forth. So that's in a nutshell. Because otherwise we can spend a long time. I mean, this is normally what I do. So you know, typically this is what the rabbinic tradition does. It's really to try to work out those hermeneutical connections. And that's why great. But what happened today, and I think you perceived it perfectly right, is that the rabbis, such as the one that we've looked before in the Torah Melech, they also do that. You have to give them that. Because they're rabbis, they also do that. Okay? But they do that without taking into account the knowledge and therefore the distance and the flexibility and the hermeneutics that was created by hundreds of years of rabbinic tradition. So the plain reading of the text is also a reading of the text. I can't disregard the plain meaning. So they put the emphasis on the plain meaning of the text, while the rabbinic tradition puts the emphasis on the induced meaning of the text. Okay, and this is and this is what happened. But essentially, what it means is that if that's the way they read that text, I have to offer another way to read that text, because if I don't, I leave it to them. And what's at stake is, what is it that Judaism is going to become? What is it that the biblical text is going to become if I leave it to people who have a political agenda and who are going to read a mandate of violence in the biblical text? So, for me, there is an obligation to engage in the text, to try to say, I can't just say, I don't like the book of Joshua, so I'm not going to read it. Like we do liturgically, we don't read it. But at the end of the day, we're making a mistake. Because if we don't read it, you leave it to them. The one that we've read. They read it, and they say to you, you have nothing to say about this, right? So it's written. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so from the rabbinic point of view then, if that's the case, and you mentioned that it's based on linguistics, right? And well, yeah, all the explanation that you gave. So it means that it's not necessarily a religious or a sacred text.
No, it is a sacred text because what is it that I cannot change is that matrix. The text with its consonants from the beginning to the end, I cannot change. So from that point of view, it's a fixed text. But what is not fixed is what you think the text says. Because when you say in the beginning, you have actually separated the words in Hebrew and you have put vowels. But nobody tells you that those vowels are right. Nobody tells you that this is how the word should be separated in order to give meaning. So the sacred text, and that's the problem with the translation, of course, back to the Septuagint, is that the Septuagint, because it has vowels and words are separated, is a fixed text with a fixed meaning, more or less. The biblical text doesn't have that fixture. It has built in, like any text that doesn't have a vowel, more flexibility of reading. So it is still a holy text, as if you want, a sacred text, but not according to the meaning that we think is the standard meaning that we've given to the text. Does that kind of answer your...
Yeah, and
More or less.
one more question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So, okay, so if we take that as, let's say, something related to the Word of God, I suppose, right? So, if there are different interpretations of that, what actually makes you, right, basically give it a kind of moral approach, right? What is telling you that you shouldn't, for example, basically go to that other direction, into that other direction, and basically.
Okay, I would say two things about this. The first is that this is the opening to the second topic that I wanted to have, which is the question of freedom of religion, diversity within a religion, in the sense that if you have more than one interpretation of the divine word, because it could be this or that, then somehow that has an impact on freedom of religion to a certain degree, because I can understand differently. What then prevents me from falling into this, or into, the Torah Taberet kind of interpretation? The answer is nothing. That's why I need to fight. That's why I need to fight in order to try to be more convincing than they are. It's never win before it's over. And it's never over. There's always someone who's going to come back and say, I don't want to read it this way. And I have to give it to them to say, I recognize that you can read it this way. I want to argue for a different reading. But I will never win over you, but you will never win over me. And we are therefore in the, remember the term, the hermeneutics of difference? This is a hermeneutic of value about the text. I need to engage that text because I need to continue to fight to say, this is not how that text should be understood. I have another way to understand that text. I understand yours, but this is not mine. And I'm going to try to be more convincing than you are, and to give you some good reasons as to why I think my reading is also meaningful. But fundamentally, you never know who's got the right mandate. And this is something that we'll see, that we'll see again. So, what I want to do, we'll do that tomorrow, but I want to give you three, and I just finished with this at this time, but I want to give you three strategies of reading. One is a theological strategy. We're going to go back to the text of Joshua, and I'm going to read it with you through the commentary of someone called André Meyer, who was a great Jewish biblicist in the 20th century. He died in the late 80s, if I'm not wrong.
from the Judaism d'Alsace of eastern France. After the war, they created a school of Jewish thought in France for people who had survived the war, and he was one of the key figures. So we look at the book of Cardenal. It's a very interesting read, theological perspective. The second one will be a more legal strategy of reading such a text that we look at. And lastly, we look with Levinas at a more philosophical strategy of reading that kind of passages there. So that's kind of the program for tomorrow. So we'll restart with that. That'll take us a little bit of time. And then once we've done that, we'll move to the second part, the second theme, as it were, which is the question of religious freedom. Okay, so the Mosaic exception doesn't seem to leave a lot of space for religious freedom, and yet at the same time we like the idea of religious freedom, including the freedom of unbelief. And where is it that we find that? In the rabbinic tradition, in the modern tradition, and also in the Christian tradition. In fact, I've added one or two little texts from the Christian tradition that we created kind of similar opening. So we move to that. Okay? Okay, thank you very much. I hope